Eternity, Judgment, and the Unfinished Self, a Buddhist reflection on heaven, hell, and the soul, part 1 of a 3-part series. A preface. Before we begin, I'd like to make something clear. This isn't an attack on Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or the countless sincere people who practice these traditions. Nor is it an attempt to ridicule, diminish, or dismiss the profound contributions these faiths have made to humanity. Much of the moral vocabulary of the West was shaped by them. They've inspired extraordinary acts of compassion, courage, scholarship, self-sacrifice, and devotion. Indeed, my own life was deeply formed within Christianity. I spent many years studying Christian theology and philosophy. My academic work focused particularly on Christian philosophy and the life of the early church. I taught catechism for well over a decade. I served in ordained ministry. During my years in the Anglican tradition, I was also received as a third-order Benedictine. Some of the most important lessons I've ever learned about love, service, contemplation, and spiritual discipline came from Christians whose wisdom and kindness I continue to cherish. I mention this not to establish authority, but simply to acknowledge that these reflections arise from long familiarity and genuine affection for the traditions being discussed. I write neither as an outsider nor as an adversary. The purpose of this essay isn't to criticize believers, it's to examine ideas. Every religious tradition, including Buddhism, contains assumptions that deserve thoughtful scrutiny. If a doctrine is true, it shouldn't fear examination. If it's false, then honest inquiry serves everyone. What follows is offered not as a condemnation, but as a philosophical reflection from a Buddhist perspective informed by comparative religion, contemporary science, and personal experience. I ask only that readers and listeners receive these reflections in the same spirit in which they're offered, respectfully, sincerely, and with goodwill toward all. The world generally rests upon two views: existence and non-existence. But for one who sees the origin of the world as it really is with correct wisdom, there is no notion of non-existence. And for one who sees the cessation of the world as it really is with correct wisdom, there is no notion of existence. The Buddha, Kacchanagotta Sutta, SN 1215. What happens after we die? What happens after we die? It's one of the oldest questions humanity has ever asked. Heaven, hell, judgment, resurrection, rebirth, enlightenment. Every culture has offered an answer, and perhaps that's understandable. Death is the great horizon of human life. Every one of us knows we're moving toward it. Every one of us has stood at a graveside, sat in a hospital room, or watched someone we love disappear beyond a threshold we couldn't cross with them. Naturally, we want answers, we want reassurance, we want certainty. We want to believe that the story doesn't end here. For many people, the Abrahamic traditions provide exactly that reassurance. Christianity teaches resurrection and eternal life with God. Islam teaches a final judgment followed by paradise or punishment. Judaism contains a wider range of perspectives, but many traditions affirm some form of continuing existence, divine justice, resurrection, or a world to come. These beliefs have comforted countless people throughout history. I don't dismiss that. In fact, I understand it. I've stood beside hospital beds. I've officiated funerals. I've comforted grieving families. I've spoken words of hope to people facing death. The emotional power of these beliefs shouldn't be underestimated. But emotional comfort and philosophical coherence aren't necessarily the same thing. A belief may be comforting and still deserve examination. And that's where Buddhism takes a very different approach. Rather than beginning with promises about what happens after death, Buddhism begins by asking a much simpler question. What exactly is it that dies? And if we can't answer that clearly, how can we be certain about what survives? The strange assumption we rarely examine. At the heart of most Western ideas about the afterlife lies a remarkably simple assumption. There's something inside us that never changes. Christianity traditionally calls it the soul. Islam speaks of an enduring self judged by Allah. Many Jewish traditions likewise affirm some continuing aspect of personhood that survives death and remains accountable before God. The assumption is straightforward. You are fundamentally the same being throughout your life, and after death, that same being continues. When I was a Christian priest, I rarely questioned this idea. Most believers don't. It's simply part of the furniture of Western religious thought. It's so familiar that it often escapes examination. Yet Buddhism asks a surprisingly direct question. Where is it? Where is this permanent thing? Can you find it? The Buddha spent much of his teaching career examining precisely this issue. In the Anattā Sutta, the discourse on not-self, he asks whether body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, or consciousness can reasonably be regarded as, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. His answer is no, not because these things don't exist, but because they don't remain. Everything changes, everything arises, everything passes away. Everything depends upon conditions. The body changes, thoughts change, memories change, beliefs change, personality changes. The person who sat in a first-grade classroom isn't the same person listening to this essay now. The teenager who fell in love, the young adult struggling to find direction, the middle-aged parent, the elderly grandparent, all of these are connected, yet none of them are identical. What we call a person appears less like a thing and more like a process, less like a statue and more like a river. The river exists, we can point to it, we can name it, we can cross it, but it's never the same water from one moment to the next. And perhaps the same is true of us. The Ship of Theseus and the self. This isn't merely a Buddhist observation. That Western philosophy has wrestled with similar questions for centuries. One of the most famous thought experiments is known as the Ship of Theseus. Imagine a wooden ship. Over time, each plank is replaced as it decays. Eventually, every board, rope, and nail has been exchanged for a new one. Is it still the same ship? Most people would say yes. Now imagine someone gathered all the original pieces and rebuilt them into another vessel. Which one is the real Ship of Theseus? The restored ship or the one built from the original materials? There isn't an easy answer. The puzzle points toward something deeper. Identity may not be nearly as solid as we imagine. The self may be less like a permanent object and more like a pattern, a continuity, a story, a relationship between changing parts. Buddhism takes this insight further. It argues that what we call the self isn't an enduring essence at all. It's a temporary arrangement of conditions, a dynamic process unfolding moment by moment. And if that's true, then some very important questions begin to emerge. Questions about judgment, questions about heaven, questions about hell, questions about eternity itself. Science begins asking similar questions. What's fascinating is that modern science has increasingly arrived at a similar puzzle. The body is in constant flux. Cells die and are replaced, neural pathways reorganize, memories are rewritten each time they're recalled. Even the personality we imagine to be fixed often shifts dramatically throughout a lifetime. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio once wrote, "The self is not a thing but a process." Likewise, philosopher Daniel Dennett described the self as a center of narrative gravity. Neither man was arguing for an immortal soul. Neither was arguing for a permanent self. Instead, both were describing something that continually emerges from countless interacting causes and conditions. In other words, something remarkably close to what Buddhism has been saying for 25 centuries. Now, this doesn't prove Buddhism is right. Science and Buddhism aren't identical. They ask different questions and employ different methods. But it's striking that both arrive at a similar difficulty when attempting to locate a permanent, unchanging self. The closer we look, the harder it becomes to find. We find thoughts, but not a thinker apart from thoughts. We find experiences, but not an experiencer separate from experience. We find memories, but not a permanent owner of those memories. Again and again, what appears to be a fixed self begins dissolving into processes, relationships, and conditions. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent much of his career exploring this problem. His conclusion was startling. Personal identity may not be what matters most. Continuity matters. Relationship matters. Causation matters. But the idea of an enduring, unchanging self may be far less necessary than we assume. And if that's true, another question naturally follows. If the self is not fixed, who exactly is being judged? That question will take us into the heart of Western eschatology, and it will be the subject of the next part of our exploration.